You ever wake up and see something so insane, your brain just refuses to process it at first? Like your eyes are sending information upstairs, but your mind's just sitting there going, no, absolutely not. That was me the morning I walked outside with a cup of coffee and saw 3 construction workers driving fence posts straight through my backyard like they own the place. I just stood there in my socks, coffee steaming in my hand, staring at this line of fresh wooden posts cutting across my garden, through my tool shed, part reese, and heading straight toward the back of my house. For a second, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. Then one of the guys glanced at me, nodded like this was a completely normal Saturday morning, and kept drilling into the ground. That's when I realized, no, they knew exactly where they were. And somehow, somebody had convinced them my kitchen was sitting on land that didn't belong to me anymore. Now, before I get into all the legal insanity and the part where my neighbor basically nuked his own life trying to steal a piece of my property, you gotta understand what this house meant to me. This wasn't some investment property I picked up during the housing boom. My parents bought this place in 1987 when this whole area was still mostly farmland and gravel roads. Back then, there weren't coffee shops and yoga studios downtown. There was a feed store, a gas station, and a diner where everybody knew your name whether you wanted them to or not. My dad used to joke that the house looked like it had been assembled by a drunk carpenter with commitment issues, but my mom loved it immediately. 3 bedrooms, wraparound porch, old oak trees everywhere. 2 acres of flat open land where the wind rolled through in the evenings like waves on water. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I grew up in that house. I learned how to ride a bike in that driveway. Broke my arm falling out of one of those oak trees when I was 10. Buried my first dog out near the fence line on the west side of the property. Every important thing in my life somehow touched that land. And after my parents passed, keeping the house stopped being about real estate and started being about memory. It was the one place left in the world where I could still hear echoes of them. The porch still creaked in the same spots my dad used to complain about. My mom's old flower beds still bloomed every spring because I never had the heart to tear them out. So when people say, it's just property, I already know they've never had roots anywhere. For 34 years, nobody questioned the property line. Not once. There were old iron survey stakes buried in the corners, county records dating back decades, and a line of cedar posts my father put up himself in the early 90s. Everybody around us knew exactly where one property ended and another began. Then the Halstons moved in. Rick Halston and his wife Valerie came from Seattle after he retired from commercial banking. You know the type. Expensive hiking boots that had never seen dirt. Luxury SUV, always spotless. Smiles so polished they didn't feel real. At first, I tried being neighborly. Hell, this is a small town. You wave when people move in. Maybe bring over pie if you're feeling ambitious. But there was something about Rick that rubbed me wrong from the start. He carried himself like he was evaluating everything around him for purchase value. Like every conversation was a negotiation he planned on winning. The first real interaction we had should have warned me where this thing was headed. I was out front changing the oil in my truck when Rick wandered up my driveway, holding one of those rolled-up blueprint tubes tucked under his arm. He smiled at me, but it wasn't friendly exactly. It was rehearsed, corporate, the kind of smile a guy gives right before he screws you in a boardroom. He said, "Hey there, neighbor. Mind if we talk about the property line for a minute?" I remember wiping my hands on a rag and laughing a little because I thought he was talking about replacing the old cedar fence or maybe trimming branches. I said, "Not much to talk about. Line's been there longer than either of us. And man, I'll never forget this part." He chuckled softly, tilted his head, and said, "Well, sometimes old lines aren't the right lines." Then he smiled again. That smile stayed with me all day for some reason. 6 weeks went by after that. Quiet weeks. Summer settling in. I worked mornings at the hardware store like usual. Came home, watered the tomatoes, watched baseball on the porch in the evenings. Every now and then I'd catch Rick standing near the edge of his property, holding papers or talking with people in reflective vests. Surveyors, I assumed. Didn't think much of it. Wealthy retirees love wasting money on pointless projects. Figured maybe he wanted a guest house or one of those outdoor kitchens rich people use twice a year. Then came Saturday morning. The sound hit first, metallic, rhythmic. T-onk, 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 T-onk. At first, I thought somebody nearby was doing road work. Then it got louder, closer. I stepped outside carrying my coffee and instantly froze. 3 workers in neon vests were halfway across my backyard installing fence posts in a perfectly straight line. One post already sat right in the middle of my vegetable garden. Another was beside my tool shed, and the line they were building was heading directly toward the back corner of my house. I walked across the yard fast enough coffee splashed onto my hand. "What the hell are you doing?" The foreman looked up calmly, like he'd expected me eventually. "Building the boundary fence, sir," I said. "Boundary between what?" He pulled a folded survey map from his back pocket and pointed casually. "According to the updated survey, this section belongs to the Halston property." I stared at him, then at the map, then back at the giant wooden post sitting in the middle of dirt my mother planted tomatoes in 20 years ago. And that's the moment my stomach dropped, because the line on that paper didn't just cut through my yard, it cut through my shed, my garden, and part of my damn kitchen. I called Rick immediately. He answered before the second ring, almost like he'd been waiting for it. "Well, good morning," he said, cheerful as ever. I skipped the pleasantries. "You better explain why there's a fence crew tearing up my backyard." And there was this pause. Not nervous, not surprised, satisfied. Then he said, "Ah, yes. About that. We recently discovered the original survey from the 70s was inaccurate. Our surveyor corrected the boundary line. Legally speaking, that strip of land belongs to us." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain still couldn't catch up to the level of insanity I was hearing. "You're telling me my kitchen is suddenly on your property?" "Well," he said slowly, "technically, part of it is. But Valerie and I are reasonable people. We'd be open to discussing a lease agreement so you can continue using the space." A lease agreement. For my own kitchen. I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles hurt. And right there, standing in my backyard while strangers hammered posts into the ground around me, I realized this wasn't some misunderstanding. Rick Houston genuinely believed he could take part of my home because he had money, lawyers, and enough arrogance to convince himself the rules didn't apply to him. What he didn't know yet was that he had just picked a fight with the one thing my family taught me never to surrender quietly. Home. I didn't even change out of my work clothes before driving straight into town. I grabbed every document I could find from the filing cabinet my father kept in the hallway closet. Property deeds, tax records, original surveys, handwritten notes from when the west fence got rebuilt in 1994, even old photographs with dates stamped on the back. By the time I pulled into Marlene Pierce's office parking lot, I looked like a man preparing for war instead of a property dispute. Now, Marlene wasn't one of those flashy attorneys you see on billboards promising million-dollar settlements with giant fake smiles. She was in her 60s, sharp as broken glass, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had a reputation around town for absolutely destroying people in court without ever raising her voice. My dad trusted her. That was enough for me. I dumped the stack of paperwork on her desk and started talking so fast I could barely breathe. She listened quietly, flipping through surveys while I explained the fence posts, the crew, the phone call, the lease agreement nonsense. At one point, she actually stopped reading, leaned back in her chair, and stared at me over the top of her glasses. "He asked you to lease your own kitchen?" I nodded, and for the first time since I'd walked in, Marlene smiled. Not because it was funny, because she knew something I didn't yet. "Oh," she said softly, "this man is either incredibly stupid or incredibly confident." "Which one's worse?" "In my experience," she said, stacking the papers neatly together. "Usually they come as a package deal." Then she got serious. She spread out my original county survey beside the copy Rick's construction crew had been using. Even to my untrained eye, something looked off. The angles didn't line up. One of the measurements suddenly shifted east by almost 30 feet for no clear reason. Marlene tapped the paper with her pen. "This survey's garbage," she said flatly. "Somebody manipulated the boundary markers." "You mean forged it?" "I mean whoever made this hoped nobody would challenge it." That sentence stayed with me, because suddenly this wasn't just some rich retiree misunderstanding a property line. This was intentional, planned, calculated. Marlene filed an emergency injunction before the end of the day, and that's when Rick Houston stopped pretending to be neighborly. By Monday morning, I got served with a countersuit thick enough to choke a horse. Rick had hired a legal firm out of Bellevue, expensive suits, polished language, the whole package. According to them, there had been historical ambiguities surrounding the boundary for decades. They claimed prior owners informally acknowledged the disputed strip as belonging to the neighboring property. Then came the part that nearly made me throw the papers across the kitchen. They demanded I remove my shed from their land. Their land. I sat there rereading that line over and over while anger crawled up my spine like heat. It's a strange feeling when someone tries to erase your reality with paperwork. You start questioning yourself for half a second even when you know the truth. I walked outside that evening and stood near the oak tree where my father buried our old golden retriever when I was a kid. According to Rick's magical new survey, That grave was on his property now too. That thought made something inside me harden. See, up until then, part of me still believed this would end reasonably. Maybe Rick would back down once lawyers got involved. Maybe this was ego spiraling out of control. But standing there in my backyard looking at those unfinished fence posts sticking out of the dirt like splinters, I realized he fully intended to push this as far as possible. And the worst part? Some people in town actually sided with him. Small towns are funny like that. Folks hear retired baker from Seattle and assume competence equals honesty. Rick started spinning this story around town that he was the victim of outdated county records and stubborn locals resisting progress. Valerie joined the church gardening committee within 2 weeks of moving in, and suddenly half the neighborhood acted like they'd known her for years. Meanwhile, I became the difficult guy because I refused to let somebody annex my damn kitchen. One afternoon at the hardware store, old Pete Larson leaned across the counter and said, "Might be easier just to settle." Nate, settle. That word irritated me more every time I heard it, because people always say settle when the thing being taken away doesn't belong to them. Marlene warned me the hearing would happen fast. Emergency property disputes usually do. Neither side wanted construction continuing while ownership remained unresolved. So for 3 straight nights, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation with Rick in my head, wondering when exactly his polite little smile had turned into open greed. The hearing happened on a Thursday morning. Rick walked into court wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. Valerie sat beside him looking wounded, like they were the injured party in all this. Their attorney spoke first for almost 40 minutes straight, tossing around phrases like historical misalignment, informal occupancy, and reasonable property reassessment. It sounded impressive if you didn't actually listen too closely. Then Marlene stood up. No dramatic speech. No theatrics. She just calmly started laying evidence on the table piece by piece like she was assembling a puzzle for children. Original county survey, tax plats, archive zoning maps, photographs from county inspections, signed utility easements. Then she introduced something I hadn't even known existed. A preserved township boundary map from 1982 stored in county archives after a flood damaged the originals. The courtroom got real quiet after that. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses, studied the map for maybe 30 seconds, then looked directly at Rick. And I swear, I will remember this moment for the rest of my life. He said, "Mr. Halston, your revised survey appears to relocate a legally established boundary by nearly 30 feet without historical justification." Rick shifted in his seat. His attorney jumped in immediately, trying to explain discrepancies and reinterpretations and procedural confusion. The judge held up one hand. That shut the room down instantly. Then he looked back at Rick and said, "Either your surveyor made a catastrophic error, or somebody attempted to fabricate a property claim." You could feel the oxygen leave the room. Valerie's face went pale. Rick stopped smiling. Finally, the judge ordered all construction halted immediately. Then came the ruling. Rick Halston had 10 days to remove every fence post, every construction marker, every piece of equipment from my property and restore the land to its original condition. And if he failed, I would be legally authorized to remove it myself and bill him for every dollar, every single dollar. Outside the courthouse, Rick finally dropped the polished businessman act. He caught me near the parking lot and hissed, "You really want to do this?" I remember staring at him for a second because honestly, the question stunned me, like somehow I was the unreasonable one. I said, "Rick, you tried to steal part of my house." And this man, this unbelievable man, actually shrugged. "It's just land." No, that's the thing. To people like him, maybe it was. Numbers on paper, assets, measurements. But to me, it was my mother's garden, my father's porch, my childhood, my memories, my home. And I think somewhere deep down, Rick knew that's exactly why he targeted it. Guys like that don't just want property. They want to see if they can make you surrender something sacred and call it business. The 10-day deadline came and went. The fence posts stayed exactly where they were. And on the morning of day 11, I woke up earlier than I had in years, poured myself a cup of coffee, stepped onto my porch, and watched the sun rise over the backyard one slow inch at a time. Then I smiled, because parked down at the end of my driveway was a backhoe. By 8 that morning, my yard looked less like a quiet country property and more like the opening scene of a demolition show. Marlene showed up first, carrying a travel mug and a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Right behind her came 2 sheriff's deputies, a flatbed truck, a backhoe, and 5 very cheerful demolition workers who looked way too excited to legally destroy something before breakfast. One of them climbed out of the truck, looked at the fence line cutting across my garden, and whistled. Well, he said, that's one hell of a bad survey. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. And honestly, that laugh surprised me, because somewhere between the court filings and sleepless nights and listening to strangers argue over the square footage of my kitchen, I'd forgotten what relief felt like. Marlene walked over and handed me a copy of the court order one last time. You ready? She asked. I looked out at those fence posts sitting in my backyard like they belonged there. Then I nodded. Let's clean up the neighborhood. The backhoe fired up with this deep mechanical growl that echoed across the property. One of the deputies stepped forward, officially documented the site for compliance purposes. And then, just like that, the first section of Rick Halston's precious fence came ripping out of the ground. God, it was beautiful. The workers moved fast too. Sledgehammers cracking wood apart, posts getting yanked free, piles of lumber tossed into the truck bed like broken furniture after a divorce. Dirt flew everywhere. My garden looked rough for a while, but I didn't even care. Every piece of that fence disappearing felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. About 20 minutes in, I heard tires screech. Rick and Valerie came flying down the road in their SUV so fast I thought they might hit the ditch. The passenger door opened before the vehicle even fully stopped, and Rick stormed across the yard red-faced and furious. What the hell do you think you're doing? One of the deputies calmly stepped between us before I could answer. Marlene, meanwhile, didn't even look up from her paperwork. Complying with a court order, she said. Rick pointed wildly toward the workers. You can't destroy private property. That almost made me laugh again. I walked over slowly, handed him the same court order he'd ignored for 10 straight days, and tapped the highlighted section with my finger. You had your chance. He snatched the papers from my hand, scanning them like somehow the words had changed overnight. Valerie finally spoke up then, voice shaking. This fence cost us $15,000. And I know this is probably going to make me sound petty, but after everything they put me through, after standing in my own backyard being told I could lease my own kitchen like some tenant in my childhood home, I couldn't help myself. I said, sounds expensive? Marlene coughed into her coffee cup, trying not to laugh. Rick looked like he might actually explode. For a second, I honestly thought he was going to swing at somebody, but the deputy standing there probably helped him rediscover self-control. Instead, he just stood there breathing hard while the crew kept tearing the fence apart behind him piece by piece. And here's the thing nobody tells you about winning these kinds of fights. The victory doesn't come all at once. It arrives in little moments. The sound of a fence post cracking, the sight of your property opening back up again, the realization that somebody who tried to intimidate you is finally powerless. That's what I remember most. Not anger, not revenge. Relief, pure relief. By noon, the last section of fencing was loaded onto the truck. My yard was a mess of dirt and tire tracks, but it was my mess again. The workers packed up their tools while Rick stood near the road looking completely hollowed out, like somebody had unplugged him from the inside. And honestly, part of me almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then he opened his mouth again. This isn't over, he muttered. Marlene finally looked directly at him. Oh, actually, she said, it very much is. A month later, the judge dismissed Rick's follow-up lawsuit for emotional distress so fast it barely lasted 10 minutes. Then came the final blow. Since he ignored the original removal order, the court ruled he had to reimburse me for legal fees, demolition costs, property restoration, and additional penalties tied to fraudulent survey practices. Total bill came out to just over $41,000. $41,000 to steal 30 feet of dirt. You'd think that would have humbled him, but from what I heard later, Rick still spent months telling people around town he'd been treated unfairly, said the courts were biased, said locals protected their own, said I overreacted. And maybe this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because if I'm being honest, there were nights afterward where I sat on that porch wondering whether I could have handled any of it differently, not legally. I know we were right. The county records proved that, but emotionally, spiritually, I don't know. There's something ugly that happens to you when you spend months defending your home from somebody determined to take it. You become suspicious, territorial. Every strange car slow near the property suddenly catches your attention. Every new survey marker makes your stomach tighten. For a while, I hated that feeling. Then one evening, maybe 6 months later, I was sitting outside during sunset watching the wind move through those old oak trees when I realized something. The house felt peaceful again, not because the lawsuit was over. Not because I won, but because I hadn't surrendered it. My father used to say a home isn't the walls or the roof. It's the life lived inside it. The memories, the people, the years nobody else can measure. Rick saw acreage. I saw my mother's flower beds. That's the difference. Funny thing is, the Halstons moved away less than a year later. Quietly too, no goodbye party. No big moving sale, just a moving truck one rainy morning and then they were gone. Last I heard. They relocated to Arizona somewhere near Scottsdale. And every once in a while, usually when I'm watering the garden or fixing something around the porch, I think about that first conversation with Rick in my driveway. Sometimes old lines aren't the right lines. Maybe. But some lines exist for a reason. So now I'm curious what you think. If somebody tried claiming part of your home with paperwork and money and lawyers, would you fight back the way I did? Or would you settle and move on with your life? And do you think people like Rick actually believe they're right? Or do they just assume nobody will stop them? Let me know in the comments because I've gone back and forth on that question more times than I can count. And trust me, after everything that happened, I'm still not sure I know the answer.